Hello and welcome to Screencast 12, Get WLM Set Up Right for DB2. In my experience, a lot of customers down the years have managed to set up WLM wrong, most especially for DB2, which is really the topic of this screencast, and sometimes for other key address spaces as well. It's actually quite important to get Workload Manager set up right, because if you get it wrong, bad things happen, like, for example, key address spaces getting starved of CPU. And that, in the DB2 case, can lead to bad or lumpy DB2 client performance. Let's take a look at a model WLM policy, or at least a starting point for discussion. And in fact, I use this very slide with most customers when I do a Workload Manager analysis. We should look, first of all, at the service classes. So the service classes are going to start at the top of the hierarchy with system, which is in another workload called system, and sysstc just below it, again in the workload called system, and then below that you can see several tiers. So system is designed for, as the name suggests, system address spaces, and we'll come across one of those later on in this screencast. sysstc is designed for further system address spaces and a few choice other ones. Now here, I would suggest WLM, which is the lock manager address space for DB2, and by the way for IMS, should be in sysstc. Below that, you might have service classes for middleware server address spaces, so continuing the blue theme from WLM, the DBM1 address space, the master address space and the dist address space all should be in a high service class for started tasks. And in the purple next to it is the equivalent for MQ, so the master and channel initiator address spaces should be in a similar position to the DB2 main address spaces. And note, as we shall refer to later, these should all be, well, particularly the DB2 ones, should be below WLM, so they should not be in sysstc. There's a principle in play here, which is that things that serve other things should be above them in the hierarchy. So just below the MQ and DB2 address spaces, one might put the CICS regions and CICS transactions and CICS transaction gateway address spaces. That's the green tier here. Below online transactions, one would put batch, and batch should be divided into high batch and low batch at very least. Now, what constitutes high batch and what constitutes low batch is an interesting side discussion. And for completeness, you'll see DDF work in the purple colour to the right. Well, DDF work is going to be of varying degrees of importance, particularly if you're using multi-period aging. And that should be alongside transactional work, but below the serving address spaces. Now, one thing to note here, and I'll refer to this again in a minute, is that the DDF work does not run at the dispatching priority of the dist address space, even though it runs in it. And this is because DDF work uses something called independent enclaves, which are separately classified from the dist address space itself. So it's perfectly safe to put dist up with DBM1 and master because it won't carry the bulk of the DDF work. So let's look at a couple of real-life cases. They're in fact from two totally different customers, but they illustrate some points. So the first one is what happens when DB2 itself isn't protected, meaning it doesn't have a workload manager goal that is sufficiently protective to make sure it serves at the same rate no matter what the load is. So in this diagram, which I've used in a number of presentations actually, you should view it this way, that along the x-axis is, for this service class, which by the way is called STC high, the actual amount of CPU used in an RMF interval as a percent of a processor. Up the side is the velocity achieved in the RMF interval. For this service class STC high, which happens here to be helpfully documented or described as high priority started tasks. Each data point, as you probably guessed, is an RMF interval. The different coloured and shaped data points refer to different days, and if you work out from the legend on the right the scheme, it's basically over month end. So what you can see if you squint at the set of data points is that as the workload builds up, the velocity achieved actually deteriorates somewhat. Now, the other thing on the graph which I hadn't mentioned is that the green line, which stays constant here, is basically the goal velocity, which is 70%, as it says in the title of the chart. So we're consistently achieving well above 70%, but when the workload builds up beyond, let's say, 90% of an engine, which is as far to the right as the x-axis goes, you might expect the velocity obtained to deteriorate further. So the 70% goal being below what's typically achieved is really not protective. So, as I say, if there was stress on the system, the velocity achieved might well come down to the 70. So this is not a protective goal. It's not going to guarantee that we continue to deliver the same service to DB2 and hence its clients, no matter what. So the recommendation one might think about here is to pull DBM1 and master out of this service class STC high and create one that you might call STCV high. The actual name doesn't matter unless you have a stupid name which gets you confused. Now STCV high, as I choose to call it, might well have a goal of something like 90%. So this is a case where DB2 isn't protected. And oh, by the way, the thing that's driving the velocity so high is probably, in my experience, using I/O samples. If you don't have I/O priority queuing turned on in the WLM policy, then you don't have I/O using samples and probably the achieved velocity would be considerably lower. So careful about playing with that setting. So this is from a second customer. So in this particular case, as you can probably see, this is the sysstc service class, which I said should have RLM and not the DB2 address spaces. So in this, the top 15 address spaces are depicted out of a total of 137, and they cover about 80%, just shy of the total CPU used by the service class. Now, you can see in the evening time that one of the DBM1 address spaces suddenly leaps up to use 40% of an engine. And actually, the corresponding master leaps up to use some as well. What I'm trying to illustrate with this example is that there can be times when the DBM1 address space uses significant CPU, and because it's on an equal footing with RLM, it can essentially lead to RLM having difficulty getting access to CPU. So this is a case where something served, the DBM1 address space, could actually compete too favourably with something serving it, namely the RLM address space. You will notice a second spike here, which is during the day, where the dist address space for one of the DB2s is also large. Now, as I previously mentioned, the DDF work in that dist address space is not actually going to be running at sysstc service class specification. It's going to be, hopefully, in something considerably lower. So in that particular case, it's not so alarming that the dist address space is in sysstc. Nonetheless, I would put it in STC high or STCV high and not in sysstc. And an interesting thing I noticed from the very same scenario was that in the system service class is the catalog address space, and here the catalog address space leaps up at the same time. So I don't actually know what was going on here, but whatever it was driving a lot of catalog activity, maybe opening and closing a lot of DB2 datasets. That's typically what drives catalog activity from DB2. So this has been a screencast where I've tried to talk through some of the complexities around setting up Workload Manager for DB2. I hope you found it enjoyable, and thank you for listening and watching.